What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 178. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I have the great Alan MacLeod making his first appearance on the show. He is a staff writer at Fairness, Accuracy, and Reporting, FAIR.org, and at Mid-Press News. And we're talking today about Havana Syndrome and direct energy weapons. We go into a ton of great stuff. Alan really knows this and is able to break it all down. Havana Syndrome is the big propaganda scheme that the mainstream media is cooking up right now to demonize America's enemies. And then we touch on a little bit because it's connected direct energy weapons, and while there's no connection actually with direct energy weapons causing the fake Havana syndrome, the US is working on direct energy weapons, and it's certainly something that we should be discussing. So all that and more on today's show. Everybody's gonna love it. Hit the share button. You find it at the Libertarian Institute, where we have our fall fund drive going on right now. If you can donate to the Institute, we're trying to raise a good amount of money, and you could definitely help us out with that. There's all kinds of great kickbacks that you could have by donating to the Institute, and also you help myself, Scott Horton, Pete Quinones, and Sheldon Richmond run the fantastic institute that Scott started. So support us over at the Institute. Also find the show on Facebook, MeWe, Twitter, YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey. You could donate at Patreon or Subscribestar. The crypto information is in the show notes page. And the last thing you could do to help out the show is to go to Paloma Verde and do your CBD shopping there. High quality CBD products over at Paloma Verde. You're not going to regret getting your CBD products from there. They have a fantastic lineup of products, really, no matter whatever you like. They got the 10 milligram gummies. They got the soft gels with a little bit more kick. The high dose extracts, if you're looking for that. They combine their products with different other substances to help you get a little bit more of effect. So melatonin if you're looking to sleep, curcumin if you're looking for like maybe a reduction in inflammation, feeling a little bit better. Tons of great stuff that you could do by buying some CBD products, ways to help your life, make you feel better. PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE, PEACE, saves you 25% off when you spend $75 or more. And here's the interview with Alan MacLeod. Hey Alan, how's it going today? Welcome to Conflicts of Interest.
Good to be with you.
All right, so I'm excited to have you on today because I've been reading you write about Havana Syndrome for a couple years now, and your report in Fair about a CIA officer getting a headache, and then we have this massive, like, international, is Russia developing a secret weapon and targeting Americans, was such a great article on it that, I've been wanting to talk to you about it. And then, especially during the Biden administration, we've had a real ramp up and focus on this, including at the CIA and everything, where they're putting out calls essentially to all U.S. diplomats like, hey, if you feel any number of symptoms, including like having nausea or a headache, you could potentially have Havana syndrome. And so this is obviously turning into what they say 200 plus cases now. I just saw a report today. I forget from where. Puck News, I think Caitlin Johnstone was citing in her article, saying that there's like a ward at Walter Reed that's filled up with these patients. And so I think this is going to be something we're going to have to talk about for a while to come. So, Alan, I guess. No worries. So what's going on with this Havana syndrome thing? And I don't know. I guess my first question is my take on it has been pretty much from the start. I really don't think there's an actual illness here. I think it's probably psychological, but I don't know. I would just your overall take on it, and then we'll start getting into the details.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a possibility. It started in 2016 in Havana, as you said. CIA agents, State Department employees, and embassy employees started feeling, relatively similar symptoms, headaches, dizziness, feeling nauseous, etc. And this was quite quickly sort of transmogrified into some sort of skullduggery going on, perhaps by the Cubans, perhaps by the Russians. That remains a possibility, but one of the the other possibilities that's not really talked about in the media too much is that this is a mass psychogenic illness, an MPI, which is when a group of people in generally quite a stressful situation start having similar illnesses, similar conditions, and it's actually kind of like a mass hysteria effect. There is, of course, also the possibility that this is just being completely played up by the national security state in order to drum up more warlike sentiment as well. We cannot rule that out as well. So ultimately, I think, especially with this new report that came out, this leaked Jason study, which showed that in 2018, the report that the US government actually commissioned said that the fact behind the Havana syndrome, what actually was causing it, was this Caribbean cricket which was chirping very loudly during mating season. I mean, the fact that even the reports say that really strongly suggests that maybe there is less to this story than meets the imagination.
Yeah. So, one of the really crazy things about this to me is how much it really took off. When it first started, it was exploited by the Trump administration to undo Obama's diplomatic process with Cuba. They took the people out of the embassy, and then that was kind of the kickoff to eventually, uh, essentially going back to a maximum pressure campaign against Cuba that had maybe been at least rolled back during the Obama administration. And so my initial thought was, well, this is going to be absolutely exposed and blown up by at least MSNBC and CNN. Like, this is a huge, easy dunk on the Trump administration. They've essentially invented an illness by playing it up. They've used it to undo one of Obama's policies. But that's not what happened. And after maybe initially, I don't remember, like after spring of 2017, a whole ton of reports until we get to 2018, when suddenly this is almost a part of Russiagate, and like the Trump administration isn't taking this new terrifying Russian weapon seriously, even though it's being used against all kinds of American diplomats. And I guess like the biggest story here was the one in GQ. It's a multi-thousand word piece. I'm sure nobody except people who want to debunk it actually read through the whole thing, like yourself. And you wrote this really great article on this. So I was just worried if you could talk about like this one particular case here, because I think it's such a great example, and that it just shows that there's not much here.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it was written by Julia Ioffe, who is one of the most prominent Russiagate theory proponents that's out there. I think she is actually Russian herself, and she bases this story largely on a CIA operative called Mark Polymeropoulos, who was based in Russia. In the winter of 2017, in December, he started feeling dizziness and nausea and serious pain in his head. And he said that he actually found that in his Moscow hotel room, it was so serious that he thought he was going to die. But the problem with the story is that there's a lot of moving parts to it which don't really make sense. For instance, just 2 or 3 hours later, after he thought he was going to die in the small hours in this Moscow hotel room, he decided to take a train to St. Petersburg and then go to a bunch of dive bars and then also do some window shopping for Christmas presents. And this is all, I would remind you, in the middle of a Russian winter as well, which is pretty serious going. I mean, I've been to Russia in the spring, and the snows are incredible. So the fact that this guy is willing to do this just slightly afterwards is a big red flag to the whole believability of this story. Also, I'm not really sure we should be taking CIA officers' words as gospel in the first place, especially this guy who, even in his Twitter profile, describes himself as like a connoisseur of alcohol. There are a lot of his symptoms are just kind of like congruent with things like a hangover or even a migraine, which is something that around 1 billion people in the world will experience at some point in their life. Not only that, he was actually diagnosed with occipital neuralgia, which, in plain English is a kind of trapped nerve in your neck. And, if anybody knows anything about the body, they know that the spine, the neck, the head, they're all kind of intertwined. And so like a problem in one place can lead to other problems in other parts of the body. So, there's a lot of reasons to doubt this, not least because even in that piece in GQ, they included statements from senior CIA officials saying that he was essentially making this whole thing up and that it was a load of baloney. And yet Ioffe, she really, takes Polymeropoulos at his word, and this has suddenly become the cornerstone of this entire thing. This Havana syndrome. This is like pretty much the biggest chunk of it, that apart from the stuff that actually happens in Cuba itself.
Right. Yeah, other than the illnesses that you have, it seems like the best evidence that they could really present is that the upper levels of the CIA didn't believe it, and that is some kind of indication that it's a part of the grand, Trump CIA director Gina Haspel just loved Vladimir Putin like Trump. I forget, it was one article I was reading about this where they were just like, well, Trump just wants to be like Putin, that's all he wants. And so at the same time, you had these people saying that Trump is like the world's greatest narcissist, and at the same time he just wants Putin to love him, which really doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever psychologically. But anyways, just it all got wrapped up into Russiagate, which has created such a, I guess, bigger problem now that we're in the Biden era, because now his administration has control over like the CIA and everything like that. And if they want to roll it into a Russiagate thing, they have a lot of room to do it, because what the State Department has done is just put out a blanket call like anybody who has any of these symptoms. And so well, I've heard, like, I think Shanghai, Hanoi, right before Kamala Harris was supposed to be there, Vienna, which is of course very important because that's where the Iran indirect talks are taking place. And so it seems like this is a real blank check for the deep state to be able to have like any kind of negative influence over anything they want. And so like if US diplomats are getting hit in Vienna, well then we can't have talks with Iran because it's too dangerous for our diplomats to be there. It seems to be a very easy jump. Anyways, I mean, is there anything, I guess, of the evidence that you find at all compelling that maybe there is a little something here, or is there any one particular case? I know, I don't know if you saw the CBS report recently from Andrea Mitchell and Ken Delinian on these three people who had experienced it in Havana initially. I think two of them had to retire, but this is one I'll get even pushback from my audience, which doesn't buy any of the Russiagate stuff, and they'll say, "But Kyle, these people have evidence of brain damage, and so there must be something going on." Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, first of all, a lot of my reporting at Fairness and Accuracy and reporting in Minpress News is looking at the national security state. And really, one of the messages I have is that journalists should not be trusting what they say. Spies and government officials, part of their job is to plant false information into the public consciousness and do it on behalf of the state. So, in my opinion, spies are about as journalistically untrustworthy as it's possible to get. And in fact, the only group more untrustworthy than spies are anonymous spies. And unfortunately, so much of this is actually being based around the testimony of people who already lie for a living, and secondly, are not even willing to go on the record about this. However, as you said, there are actually now hundreds of people who claim to have been hit with this Havana syndrome. Unfortunately, the symptoms are also wide ranging. Nobody has the same exact set of symptoms as other people. And so, frankly, I think we've reached a point where everybody who works for the government now knows about Havana syndrome. And so, if they get a migraine, a headache, a trapped nerve, suddenly they're thinking, oh, this might not be indigestion, this might not be a headache, this might not be a hangover. Maybe I've been targeted. And people who work in those sorts of jobs tend to be rather paranoid, sometimes for very good reason, of course. They are in the surveillance business after all. And so ultimately, I think, people around the world, when this diagnosis is being offered to them, they might grab hold of it, especially now that we've got this situation where They might even have an opportunity to retire early on a full pension, to have complete medical benefits. This is a really great opportunity for some people, ultimately. I think that's really the problem. If you actually look at some of the data which comes out about, people have actually suffered damage, one of the big studies they point to is the JAMA study. I had a look at that, and actually, as a former academic, the science really does not hold up at all. And certainly the experts I spoke to were of the same opinion. I mean, for example, the JAMA study found that 28% of people who took their cognitive tests had experienced cognitive damage or impairment. But when you actually look at what their cutoff for that would be, they gave them a bunch of tests. And if the respondents scored in the 40th percentile or lower to a range of cognitive tests like memory or reaction, they were diagnosed as impaired. So in plain English, what that means is if you score less than what 60% of the general public would score on that, you are diagnosed as being impaired because of this. What's interesting about that is that still of the people who claim to have Havana syndrome, only 28% of them actually scored below that 40% line, which is less than what you'd expect if you were just testing people randomly, members of the public at random. So a lot of this stuff doesn't really make sense. And I think, even if we accept that a lot of people might have been damaged for one reason or another, there are much more mundane answers for that, which tend to be these sorts of ailments that most people will experience once or twice in their lives.
Yeah. So, yeah, one of the things that I think I pulled this from the BuzzFeed report where they got a CNN story. And in there, one of the things that they find was that there wasn't like a baseline to compare it to. And so they're doing these cognitive tests on people. But if you don't know how they would have scored in, say, 2015, then you don't know what impact the alleged event would have had happened on them in 2017. Like, they may have always scored in the bottom 40%. Like, there's 100% of people, so somebody's gonna be in the bottom 40, right? It could have been these people before, and there's not
Yeah.
that. The CDC report also highlights that a lot of it's based on the self-reporting of people, and they were only asked like a couple of years later, like in 2018, they were asked, "Hey, did this contribute to your cognitive decline?" Which is just something that people can't really analyze well, right? Like 2 years ago, what was your ability to remember a 7-digit number? Compared to now, it's just especially as like a lot of these people seem to be like in their 50s, or at the age where you start to hear a lot of people saying like, boy, the 40s were okay, but when I hit 50 I really started to feel it and stuff. Like it could just be a part of the natural decline. Also, it just seemed to me like environmental factors had to play, of course, like the crickets is the big one. And I think they've actually been able to replicate and identify. Like the AP actually got a hold of one of these recordings, and lab was able to identify and replay it. And so, at least in part, because I think one of the initial claims is this was some kind of sonic weaponry, and so that seems to be kind of debunked by the cricket plane, and yet that doesn't really seem to factor in, and it just kind of morphed into now it's a microwave weapon or a direct energy weapon thing, without any kind of really examining the fact that the initial cause was wrong, right? I mean, is that your understanding on like the sonic weapons and like the crickets impact here?
Yeah, I think so. And I would also suggest a little thought experiment. Imagine if Russian diplomats and state employees in Washington, D.C. started saying that they were being attacked by some sort of crazy weapon, and they actually had a recording of the weapon, and they displayed it to the public. And what it found was it was clearly cicadas in that recording. And imagine if the Russian media kept running with this, saying, well, this is just proof of the devious American plot. What would we think about that Russian media? We'd think they were absolutely off their rockers, lost the plot. And yet, pretty much the opposite thing, with just roles reversed with US and Russia, is still going on to this day, which makes me highly suspicious, especially because it's the United States official enemies that are being, labeled as the aggressors, which is obviously something that the national security state would have an interest in promoting. Seems to be happening all around the world. Everybody seems to have slightly different opinions on what's going on. But the experts in this sort of technology that I spoke to in manufacturing and electromagnetism said that ultimately the weapons that are being alleged to have to have been used on these American officials, not only don't exist, but simply cannot exist. That they break the laws of physics essentially. Directed weapons, directed energy weapons certainly do exist, microwave cannons, sound guns, etc. But what they were saying to me anyway was that simply the sort of level of energy that would be needed to rattle someone's brain like that simply is not feasible right now, and in fact, probably is not actually feasible within the realms of physics.
Yeah, I actually saw this article this morning in Foreign Policy by Cheryl Roffer on microwave weapon attacks. And one of the things that she pointed out was to carry out the attack that they allege, it would take like the power equivalent of 200 laptop batteries. And like it would have to almost be based in a building. And then another thing that she points out is that if it is microwave weapons, you should see some kind of external mark, right? So if you claim you have brain damage, then there should be something on your skin to indicate it. You know, she points out that like anybody who's ever put something frozen in a microwave knows that microwave cooks things from the outside in, not the inside out. And so there should be some kind of evidence on the skin or something, and you see absolutely none of it. And in fact, I was looking through, I don't know if you've maybe seen differently. I haven't seen anybody with any kind of actual physical, other than like internal brain injury, that anybody has ever pointed to as evidence of any of these attacks.
I think that's right. Generally the symptoms tend to be more mental and physical and cognitive. So it's, as I said, dizziness, nausea, trouble with memory, headaches, that sort of thing. The problem with that is that that's kind of self-reporting again, and that ultimately, if somebody just wanted to just say they had these things, there's very little, there's not really that much we can do to prove or disprove that. So again, we're just left with this big question mark. And again, I come back to the fact that, even CIA higher ups were poo-pooing this idea as nonsense before. And it's basically based on, people who are either anonymous or not anonymous, state employees who should be, treated with a little bit of a grain of salt, is what I'm saying. Is because, they do have uh, certainly a reason that they might be going after their official enemies. There's certainly political capital to be gained from this.
Oh, definitely. And that seems to be one of the real benefits of this for the deep state, right? Is that it is such a vague set of illnesses. And, I've made this joke on the show before that I've moved around the U.S. quite a bit, and I now live in Colorado from living on the East Coast in Boston, almost near the ocean. And so from moving to the two places, just the amount of allergies that have and the different times of the year they kick in, the migraines that I get at different times, living at elevation versus not, the smells of things, living more rural than living in the city, all like, I just feel differently. Like I get headaches sometimes, I get nauseous sometimes. Also, I played football growing up, so I'm sure if somebody did a brain scan of me, like I definitely
Mm.
have a history of concussions, right? And so no doubt they would be able to show concussion like brain injury if they did a brain scan. And that's exactly what they're pointing out. And so I don't know, I feel like I could qualify for Havana syndrome, which makes me really doubt that it's true because I've never been, to Havana, and I don't think the Russians are targeting me with any weapons. And so any final thoughts on Havana syndrome before we talk about like the US kind of looking into these direct energy weapons in your new article?
Well, I mean, I think one thing we should certainly be looking at is the possibility that this is a mass psychogenic illness, which is essentially when people, particularly in a stressful situation, all start feeling similar symptoms. These are actually quite common. So, for instance, in 2011, 18 school children in Leroy, New York, started having a mass psychogenic illness all at the same time. They had tics, they had like lots of uncontrollable muscle spasms. And this all happened right at the time when they were taking their finals. This is a high stress environment. I'm sure being a spy or a State Department employee in Havana or Hanoi or Moscow is kind of stressful, especially given the fact that there's new news out that a lot of CIA informants all around the world seem to be dying off at a very high rate. They don't seem to be able to be keeping this a secret. And so, of course, the employees that are doing things in these enemy countries, they're certainly under a lot of stress. So I can imagine that something could trip them off, and this might be just that.
Yep. Yep, and I'm sure being away from their families and stuff like that too. And as far as like the mass like psychological thing, it just imagine like being in like a movie theater or something. And there's like a big like info on like lice or something like that. Worry about lice, and then everybody's gonna start scratching their head and it's just the way it works. It happens. That's brain people. Anyways, let's talk about these direct energy weapons. This is from September 20th at 2021 from Mid Press News. Havana Syndrome, direct energy weapons in the new Cold War. While the jury is still out on who committed the attacks against U.S. officials, or even if there were any attacks at all, directed energy weapons certainly do exist. Havana might be science fiction, but directed energy weapons are very much scientific fact. And so while we're talking about this, let's talk about what our government is looking into developing and what these weapons could do.
Yeah, sure. So direct energy weapons are certainly a real thing, and they're not only just science fact, they're actually in operation. So we have things like laser cannons being used by the military. They've been installed on Navy vessels. The Israelis have a laser beam system that can knock out drones from the sky, or the Chinese government has developed a laser weapon that can destroy and disable a car's engine from over a mile away. We've got examples of microwave weapons. Rail guns are increasingly being looked at and indeed used by the U.S. Navy as well. I detail all that in the article. I've got links to the documents there. There's a lot of positives and benefits of using these direct energy weapons. One, they tend to be completely silent, and that's a big plus if you're on a battlefield, that you can hide your location so you don't give it away, especially in urban warfare. Two, they tend to be much cheaper than standard weapons that we use right now. The firing of a railgun, for instance, which is essentially pushing a projectile using electromagnetism at super high speed, much higher than we can get from bullets right now, that they tend to cost about $1 per shot. And so if you're thinking about, a high energy railgun versus like a cruise missile, there's really no comparison there. Also, things like sound cannons are also being used. They tend to be used more for domestic control. If you were at the Women's March or some of the George Floyd protests, or even at the Occupy protests, you might have seen police going around with these noise weapons, and in fact, even using them on people. I know one police department in the US, the NYPD, was forced to suspend its use, and they actually had to pay nearly $750,000 to Black Lives Matter protesters who had been targeted with this noise weapon. That's because it shoots sounds at around 150 decibels directed at people. It has an amazing effect, which, it really pushes everyone around. There's no resisting this sort of weapon. Same with the sort of laser weapons, which fire really high intensity heat guns, heat waves at people. It can burn the skin, but it doesn't do serious lasting damage. But ultimately, things like sound weapons can do damage because, of course, anything over about 85 decibels, and you're looking at potentially permanent hearing loss if you hear that for more than a few seconds. And so, yeah, the police have been forced to suspend their use by courts. And so these things are absolutely being used right now. But actually, the US appears to be in the lead rather than Russia, China, or any of its adversaries.
Yeah, so that's one interesting thing that I pulled from or just kind of took from your article was whenever they talk about Havana syndrome and they talk about directed energy weapons, they only use they usually just use the phrase directed energy weapons, which sounds far more like scientific and futuristic, where anybody who saw the first Transformers movie knows what a railgun is, right? Like this isn't like some crazy technology or something. And in fact, like you could like find people like building like their own miniature versions of railguns, even though I think the US like has a lot of trouble with scaling it up to the point where would be used for military. And there's a lot of work to do on it still, but it's just very interesting that they only use when they're talking about Havana, they use like the directed energy weapon phrase. But then if you're just like if they're just reporting on it, they're not saying like the New York police are using directed energy weapons against Black Lives Matter. They'll call them sound cannons. Or again, if we're talking about railguns, in like the U.S. Navy is looking to develop new railgun technology, they'll just say railguns, not the U.S. Navy is developing directed energy weapons. And so I just thought that was a really interesting propaganda point in all this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's very important the sort of words we use to describe things because they really frame and cue the reader as to how to think about things. We don't talk about carpet bombing other nations. We talk about surgical strikes. We don't talk about torturing people. We talk about enhanced interrogation techniques. And there are so many more examples of this, most of which are really used to try to shield the people, trying to just soften the blow about what is actually going on. Another example might be, I'm sure everybody's heard the phrase officer involved shooting, which tends to mean a police officer kills somebody or at least shoots them. But they always use this sort of weird passive voice language to try to, yeah, just sort of cue readers about, how to feel about this. And it actually works. It's it's really incredible how the human brain works, about how we can be, suggested about something, and even our reactions to things are really lessened or heightened by the sort of words that journalists use.
Yeah, so in your analysis there, you point out that one of the advantages to some of these direct energy weapons, other than silence, would be the cost, because eventually, like if a railgun can work and they get it down and everything, it's a hell of a lot cheaper for like a pound of nickel to use as the munition than like a cruise missile or something like that that's going to cost multi-million-dollars that for every missile. The pound, but like the R&D and the building the railgun technology up front would probably be the expensive cost. So I was just wondering if you had any idea how much money the U.S. was throwing at this at this time. I'm sure it's an insane amount, but I was just wondering if you had any idea.
Well, I don't have specific numbers, but I'll give you an example. Last month, the UK Ministry of Defence announced a $100 million contract with Raytheon UK to create anti-aircraft and anti-UAV laser weaponry to be fitted to its ships. So if the UK is spending hundreds of millions of dollars, I'm sure the US is spending a great deal more. And another, example of why this technology is great is because it's effectively limitless. As long as you have that electricity supply, you can fire that laser weapon, or you can fire that sound cannon or that railgun. So there's not really a problem with like reloading or anything like that, or just shipping or supplies, or just general logistics. As long as you've got that electricity source, and of course on some U.S. ships you've got they're nuclear powered, so of course they've got pretty much limitless electricity. So this stuff is I don't want to call it like a silver bullet, a magic bullet, but it's certainly, when you read how people are talking about it in the defense industry and even state officials, they certainly think that this is the technology that might define 21st century warfare.
Right. And do we have any idea on how long it's going to be before they could deploy some of this technology? I
Oh, yeah, it's already been deployed. It's already been deployed in Afghanistan. There are already railguns on US ships. There are already anti-aircraft lasers being used to shoot down drones that are put on Navy ships. Generally, the U.S. Navy is quite worried about the idea of sort of low-scale attacks, maybe the sort of drones that you might buy in, just a general store on Amazon for a few $100s. You tape some C4 to it, and you launch an armada at a ship. That could like completely blow up a ship or an Air Force base, and you could do that relatively easily, relatively cheaply, relatively silently from, a couple of miles away, which might make the sort of occupation we saw in Afghanistan very difficult. Yeah, I mean, even at the London 2012 Olympics, these sorts of LRADs, they're called, these sound cannons, long-range acoustic devices, were being fitted to police or army vehicles. So these things already exist. In fact, there was this big, should we, shouldn't we thing in the late 2000s about sending these microwave weapons to Afghanistan. I think in the end, the US military decided not to pursue that too much. I think it might have been because of the bad publicity or something like that. But yeah, ultimately they decided against it. But these things, as I said, already exist. Perhaps not to the enormous scale that maybe sometimes in science fiction movies and stuff happen. But yeah, certainly on a smaller scale, these things already exist. They're fitted to trucks and they can be, moved around pretty easily.
Yeah, I guess we're not quite at the Star Wars level yet with like using laser cannons and stuff like that, but
Sure.
maybe one day. One
But
of
you
the
can
things.
lasers can be used. They can fire a beam that's hot enough to melt components in an engine and therefore take down, for instance, small planes like Cessnas or pretty much any road vehicle as well that's maybe doesn't have like super armor plated on it or anything. But yeah, anything like a sort of like a technical truck could certainly be taken out by a laser already and from quite a long distance as well.
One of the things you point out that is probably really important is these what they call swarm drone attacks, where again they'll put a whole bunch of like C4 grenades onto these small drones, and the U.S. I think has the ability to shoot these things down, but the missiles cost a hell of a lot more than the drones, and so you're kind of losing the battle in a way if you're having to deploy your expensive anti-aircraft against these very cheap little drones, and so this could be a real way to look at anti-aircraft going forward where it seems cost effective as more and more of these insurgency groups have these small drone weapons. You have a section in here on Cold War 2.0 in your article, and I was just wondering how much you think that these weapons are, I guess, going to be used potentially in a coming Cold War, but also the rhetoric used to ramp up the Cold War.
Yeah, generally, I think it's probably pretty unlikely that there's going to be any serious fighting against Russia and China simply because they have credible deterrence in, weapons of mass destruction. But when you listen to people in think tanks and state officials talking about it, often the phrase they use is kicking each other under the table, which means like small, directed fights and skirmishes going on. The sort of thing that was probably very likely happening during Cold War One between the Russia and the U.S. and to a lesser extent China. These things are, as we've been talking about, quite useful for this because they're quite secretive. It is certainly plausible that you could, put one of these weapons in a hotel room or a truck outside and injure a US official or a Russian official or whoever and get away with it because, unless you know what's going on and you've got some sort of meter, nobody knows if microwaves are being, targeted. It's very difficult to actually prove this. So these are the sort of weapons that could be being used. And so ultimately, I think it is quite plausible that in the future, these sorts of things might be used in a potential Cold War or even a hot war, as unlikely as it is.
Yeah, especially like something where Syria, where there wasn't maybe a whole lot of direct confrontation between the U.S. and Russia, but from time to time I did read reports about downing each other's drones or in some way like hacking or disabling each other's drones and stuff like that. So there may be kind of some of this stuff going on that's just not really public. Alan, is there anything else I forgot to ask you about Havana or direct energy that you want to touch on before we wrap up here?
No, I think we got everything.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Everybody, check out Fairness, and Accuracy in Reporting. I think it's fair.org, where you can find Alan and a whole bunch of other great writers talking about how the mainstream media absolutely fails every time and is just a propaganda machine. And then also you write at Mid Press News, where you can find a whole bunch of great news. A lot more Middle Eastern stuff at Mid Press News and a lot of great stuff written over there. Alan, thank you so much for coming back on the show, and just plug like your social media and stuff like that.
Yeah, good to be with you. As I said, I work for mintpressnews.com, so check them out and bookmark them. You can follow me on social media. I'm most active on Twitter at AlanRMacleod. So that's at Alan R. MacLeod.
All right, Alan, thank you so much for coming on the show.
No worries.